Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are watching this video. Hello, and I miss you all. This is the Studies Weekly video for week 28, the effects of the advancements in communication and transportation. Now, last week we read about the Louisiana Purchase, and the biggest effect that had on our country was that it doubled our country. We are now twice as big as before, right? So now we're trying to figure out, how are we getting people out here? How did they travel? How did we get messages to people that were on the other side of our new country? Okay, so this one is a very cool article. It's probably one of my favorites in the Studies Weekly. So we are going to, I'm going to go through, read it like I did last week, highlight it. Hopefully you guys were able to figure out a way to watch the video and highlight as I was going through. Like I said, you would just have to make this screen smaller and make your internet browser window smaller as well. So hopefully it worked out for you guys. Just because I'm highlighting does not get you out of highlighting. Remember that. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull up the Studies Weekly. Okay, make this a little bigger. There we go. Okay, so has anyone ever heard of the Pony Express before? Show of hands. Not that I can see you. This was basically the first way for us to get mail across the country. So let me, sorry, I moved some things around. Let's go ahead and start. Jump right in, okay? So wanted, Pony Express riders. The Pony Express was a mail service of horseback riders who delivered mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. That first sentence tells us exactly what it was. The riders did so in an amazingly short time of only 8 to 10 days. Today, a letter can travel the same distance in 2 to 3 days using regular mail. 8 to 10 days. Compared to 2 and 3 now. But we got to think back about the time that this was in. However, in the late 1800s, it usually took the mail at least 25 days to make it by stagecoach and much longer by wagon or ship. So now that 8 to 10 days doesn't sound so bad. The Stage and Freight Company of Russell, Majors, and Waddell started the Pony Express. The owners of the company came up with the idea of sending out horsemen to ride almost 10 to 15 miles for a fresh horse and every 50 to 75 miles to change riders. By having so few stops, the mail could travel in record time. Okay, so it was started by Russell, Majors, and Waddell. That was the company. Pony Express riders had to know how to ride and manage horses. One story says a California newspaper ran an ad from the hiring company that said, wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Now, why would they want orphans? That seems very strange. If you think about it, this was a very dangerous job. So orphans, we know, don't have parents, right? So if one of these young men, fellows, right, not women, men, one of these young boys were to die, they wouldn't have to tell any families or they wouldn't be missed. This ad made the job sound very dangerous. Wiry means slim and strong, so a very thin man. Not all historians agree that this was a real ad. One historian found an ad for the Pony Express from the Sacramento Union that ran on March 19, 1860. It said, "Men wanted. The undersigned wishes to hire 10 or a dozen men familiar with the management of horses as hostlers or riders on the Overland Express route via Salt Lake City. Wages $50 per month and found room and board." Okay, so room and board means that they get paid for, or where they're staying gets paid. Pony Express riders carried the mail in mochilas, which is Spanish for knapsack. The mochilas was a rectangular shaped blanket-like leather bag. It was designed to fit snugly over the saddle. The mochilas had 4 cantinas or pockets. So cantina is a pocket to hold the mail. Station masters would lock each cantina to prevent the mail from being stolen. Only the station masters at each end of the line had keys to the locks. When riders changed horses or riders, they lifted the mochilas off one horse and placed it on the back of the fresh horse. The Pony Express was a quick and exciting way to deliver the mail, but it didn't last long. The first rider set out from St. Joseph, Missouri on April 3rd, 1860. Okay, so that was the first rider. But by then, a telegraph line from St. Louis to Salt Lake City was almost completed. Once it was finished, it was possible, gotta flip over. It was possible to send messages across the continent in a matter of minutes. So it's like the first phone call. The first telegram was sent to San Francisco on October 24th, 1861. And on October 26th, the Pony Express stopped making its runs. So October 26th of 1861. So it started April 3rd of 1860. So about only a year and a half is how long it lasted. Today, the picture of a horse rider crossing the West is one symbol of the strength it took to ride headlong into the new frontier. So I highly encourage you to watch the video after you've read that article, watch the video on the Pony Express. Okay. Shrinking the distance. Well, here's our little narrative. Jackson, I've got my camera ready. Where and when should we go today? Well, Alana, I think we should see some of the great innovations or inventions, and innovation is an invention, interchangeable, in transportation. The country grew and spread out across the West starting in the early 1880s. It was difficult for people to stay in touch and move from place to place. It didn't take long, though, for some great inventors to do their part to help shrink the distance between the East and the West. What do you mean, shrink the distance? They didn't really make the country smaller. No, Alana, you're right. But they did make traveling from place to place much faster than ever before. This made it feel like the distance between the East and the West had shrunk. Sounds interesting. Where do we start? I thought we could visit the National Road to begin with, and then the Erie Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad. Sounds great. Let's go. Click. All right, so the National Road. When brave settlers began moving west in the early 1800s, Poor quality roads became a serious problem, and the Appalachian Mountains cut the country almost in half, which made the trip difficult for early travelers. The mountains also made it almost impossible for Western farmers to ship their produce to the East Coast. Congress decided it was time to build a new hard surface road across the Appalachians and to the Western farmlands. Horses and mules and oxen hauled materials and supplies, but people actually built the road by hand. First workers cleared trees and brush off of the land. After lining the roadbed with smooth rocks and sand, workers poured gravel on top. So this road, the purpose of it was to connect farmers in the West to over the mountains and over the mountains back into the West. By 1811, the government ordered construction of the National Road to begin in Cumberland, Maryland. Workers eventually built the National Road through Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana, and they ended it in Vandalia, Illinois by 1839. So it cut through all of these states, and by 1811 is when they commissioned this road. By 1839 is when they finished it. So do the math, right? 28 years it took to build this road. The 620-mile road was one of the first interstates. An interstate is a road that runs in between states that the government ever built. The highway made it possible for people and goods to move back and forth between the eastern and western United States. So an interstate, like I-95, goes in between states. But then we have roads called intrastates, like I-4, which only goes from like Daytona to Tampa. So that's only within a state. Okay, the Erie Canal. In 1817, thousands of workers began building the Erie Canal. The huge ditch, so we know what a ditch is, right? We have them all over by our houses, stretched 363 miles from Albany, New York by the Hudson River to Buffalo, New York by Lake Erie. 1817. Workers completed the canal in October 1825. So again, let's do some math. 17 to 25, 6 years, right? 8 years, 8 years. The new canal provided a direct water route between New York City and the Great Lakes. It was faster than using horses or mules to transport people and goods. Plus, it cut the cost of shipping by almost 90%. So instead of putting goods on a ship and having to go up and around New York, so let me show you on a map. So typically what would happen is a ship would dock here, get goods, and they'd have to go around basically United States, and right in here is another river. Okay, so now they're saving money because they just cut across the state of New York, basically. Before the canal was built, it cost $100 to ship a ton of freight by wagon from Buffalo to New York City. On the Erie Canal, the price was just $10 a ton. Okay, so a ton is 2,000 pounds. So if you have 2 tons, that would typically be $200 by wagon. Now, it only costs you 20 bucks. Okay, so definite benefits. So $100 by wagon on the Erie Canal, $10. The canal took traffic away from the National Road, and it brought more business to New York City. In fact, New York became the biggest seaport in the country. Other states began to build canals to link with the Erie Canal, and soon 3 more canals stretched across Indiana and Ohio. After workers completed these canals, a frontier farmer could ship products all the way to the east in less time and for less money than ever before. For the first time, people could travel through the Appalachian Mountains without bouncing around for days or weeks in a stagecoach or a wagon. Many people used flatboats and steamboats to ship goods along the canals. The flatboat was a rectangular shaped flat bottom boat with square ends. So basically exactly how it sounds. It was used to float goods and passengers downriver, often picking up farm produce along the way. Flatboats could not travel upstream, so going against the current. And workers usually took them apart and sold them for lumber once the boats reached their destination. So that's pretty interesting. So it was this wooden boat, right? It couldn't make the journey back up north. So what it would do is they'd start north, pick up things, pick up people along the way as they were traveling. And then by the time they got to their destination, since that boat can't make it back up north, they took the boat apart and sold that. Sold the wood off of the boat. Okay, the steamboat, however, traveled along the canals, but it had the steam powered engine. So this allowed it to travel about 3 miles an hour upstream and 8 miles an hour downstream. Okay, so it had the ability to go upstream. Granted, 3 miles an hour and only 8 miles an hour downstream, but it was able to make return trips. Okay, the Transcontinental Railroad. By the 1850s, workers had built many railroads in America. Most of them were in the East. Okay, so when we talk about the East, let's look at this map. Let me see if I have another highlighter color. Yes, I do. So let's look at this map, okay? The Appalachian Mountains run pretty much like this, okay? So I'm gonna say App. Those are the Appalachian Mountains, okay? So what the National Road did and really what the Erie Canal did, it allowed those people who moved out west, okay, were pretty much they were farmers, okay? That's really why they moved there. There was flat land, fertile land, that was their job, okay? So these mountains posed a problem, right? So they had all of this food, well, they needed to make a living, so they needed to ship it back to all of these people who were now living along the eastern coast of the United States, okay? So the National Road, which is actually this line right here, okay, it allowed people that were in the West to ship their goods over to the people on the eastern coast. It cut right through the mountains, so it helped them in that regard. And same with people in the East. If they wanted to travel, they could now use that National Road to go through the mountains. This right here is the Erie Canal. Okay, so it pretty much cut through New York. These right here, and we know that they kind of go like this. These are the Great Lakes. There's multiples of them. It's not one big lake. These are the Great Lakes. So again, people in the East could now travel throughout the Great Lakes, hook up to the Erie Canal, and ship their goods, or ship goods back to the farmers. Okay. Now we're going to talk about this area right here. This is the Transcontinental Railroad. And remember also that right along here is what? the Mississippi River, right? So this is a huge other waterway that allows people to travel north, south to a certain part and then get on a railroad, or a certain part, then get on the road, okay? So now let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. By the 1850s, workers had built many railroads in America. Most of them were in the East because that's where the population was. That's where everybody lived. Heading to the West still meant traveling in horse or oxen-pulled wagons, or people sailed to the West Coast by ship. Either way, the journey was difficult and took several months. Okay, so traveling from or traveling west, heading west, okay, took several months. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. He and many government leaders talked about building a railroad that would stretch all the way across the United States, from ocean to ocean. Two companies, each being paid for every mile of track it laid, would race to see which could lay more track. So you wanted to lay more track because essentially your company got paid more. They're being paid by every mile. The Union Pacific, so this is one company, the Union Pacific started at Omaha, Nebraska. To lay the track, the company hired mainly soldiers who had fought in the Civil War, former slaves, and German and Irish immigrants. The Central Pacific, okay, so they started in Omaha, Nebraska. These were the people that they hired. Okay, so they started here. Okay, so this is the, I know you can't really see that. Oh, yeah, you kind of can. Okay, the Union Pacific. Okay. The Central Pacific started in Sacramento, California, and that company hired mostly Chinese immigrants for the project. Okay, so Central Pacific started here, and they hired Chinese immigrants. Now let's think about this. Why would who they hired be so different? Well, the Union Pacific, they had basically this whole population to choose from, right? They had the whole United States to choose from, who they wanted to work for them. So most of those people, you had young men. They wanted obviously strong young men. The Civil War had just happened, or was in the process of happening. Okay, so they wanted people who had a strong work ethic. People came from Europe, right? Europe's over here. People came from Europe. So that's where the German and the Irish immigrants came from, right? Over here, we have the Central Pacific. Well, what do we have on this side? Pacific Ocean, right? But we still had people coming in from other countries. Now, to the west, what's on the other side of the Pacific Ocean? Asia, right? So back in second grade, because I remember this because I taught it to you, back in second grade, we talked about immigration. In New York, there was an immigration center called Ellis Island, right? Where all those European countries, all those immigrants came from, okay? Ellis Island, Europe. In California, there was a similar station called Angel Island. I always remember this, Angel Asia, right? So they didn't have many people to choose from. They didn't have a high population of people to choose from. They just had the Asian immigrants coming in. So that's who they got to work for them. The Central Pacific, so that is this one, right, had the most difficult job since its workers had to build many bridges and blast through steep mountainous terrain. What mountain region is over here? The Rocky Mountains, which are way higher than the Appalachians. Appalachians look like tall hills compared to the Rocky Mountains. Okay. Laying track for the Union Pacific wasn't exactly a piece of cake, though. Its workers often had problems with American Indians in the area who didn't want the railroads built across their hunting grounds. So they each had difficulties. So Central Pacific had to build bridges and blast through steep mountains. The Union Pacific had flat land, but they had to deal with the American Indians. So who had it worse? The companies finally met at Promontory Summit in Utah on May 10th, 1869. The Central Pacific coming from the west had laid 690 miles of rails, but the Union Pacific, coming from mid-country, Union Pacific came in first by laying 1,086 miles of rails. The first transcontinental railroad was completed at last, and a golden spike was driven into the ties to celebrate the wetting of the rail. So joining. Wetting is a joining of two things, or the joining of the rails. People and goods could now travel from the east to the west in less than 10 days. That's a huge difference than months. Okay? So when we say east to west, obviously these people, we see that the Transcontinental Railroad did not go all the way across the country. So if somebody in Virginia, right here, wanted to travel to California, they still had to take a long journey to get to the railroad, right? By way of other railroads, by way of the national road, however, and then be able to travel from here to here in 10 days. Okay? All right. Down at the bottom here, inventiveness. When the United States grew so large that transportation became too slow and too difficult, Americans used their inventiveness to solve the problem. Inventiveness is the ability to think of creative ways to do new things. Are you creative? Are you inventive? Right? It took inventiveness for Russell, Majors, and Waddell to find a way to deliver the mail across the nation in less than 10 days. It took inventiveness for engineers to build the national road across mountains and through forests. It took the inventiveness of great builders to design and dig the Erie Canal. It also took inventiveness to complete the very difficult task of building the Transcontinental Railroad across rivers, through mountain passes, and over uneven ground. Thanks to the inventiveness of many great leaders, engineers, and builders, amazing improvements in transportation made crossing this great country faster and easier than ever before. The Conestoga wagon. Now, when we think of covered wagons, typically this is what we think of. This is what we picture, right? The Conestoga wagon was a type of covered wagon used to carry freight and people from place to place. Okay, used to carry freight and people from place to place. This was before faster types of transportation were invented. People first built this type of wagon in the Conestoga region of Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. The Conestoga wagon had a curved wagon box. So let's kind of put this up here. So a curved wagon box that rose at both ends. Wagon makers did this so that when a wagon traveled up and down hills, its load would be less likely to shift and its tailgate wouldn't have to bear as much strain. A wagon could carry up to 5 tons of freight. So a ton is 2,000 pounds. 5 times 2,000, 10,000 pounds. And usually 6 horses or oxen would pull it. So this was not a small wagon by any means. It had a white canvas hood to protect the wagon box from dust, sun, and rain. The Conestoga wagon was one of the most popular wagons used by the early pioneers traveling west. So a lot of times when families were like, all right, let's move to the west, they would pack up their whole house, right? All of their belongings, all of their furniture, and they would use a wagon like this, okay? 10,000 pounds. That is a big wagon. What was the golden spike? The golden spike was a railroad spike made of gold. Clever, right? It was used to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, which we just read about. The golden spike had the names of important railroad officials and the date engraved on its side. So you can see that here. The words "the last spike" were engraved on the top. The golden spike was dropped into a pre-drilled hole as part of the ceremony, marking the joining of the rails. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific Railroad, and T.C. Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific Railroad, then drove an ordinary iron spike into the final railroad tie. When the two men took turns driving the spike into the tie, each missed on their first try. This made the railroad workers laugh and tease the men. Why would they? Why would all those railroad workers laugh? These two big shots, president of the company and vice president of the other company, went to go hammer a spike into the railroad ties where it joined, and they both missed. Two big headshots of a company, of a railroad company, missed when they were hammering the spike into the thing. When the final spike was driven in, a telegraph message shot out across the country. It simply said, "Done." Okay, so this golden spike did not actually join the two railroads. It was just like a memento that said this was done. And lastly, Theodore Judah. One of the greatest influences of the Transcontinental Railroad was a man named Theodore Judah. Trained as an engineer, Theodore worked on the Erie Canal and several small railroads in the east. He also traveled to California, where he helped build a railroad line from Sacramento to the gold fields of Folsom. Okay, so he was an engineer, there it is. He worked on the Erie Canal and other small railroads. So he was an important person and somebody they probably took a lot of feedback from. Railroad officials doubted that tracks could be built across the Sierra Nevada mountains, but after working in the California line, Judah firmly believed it was possible. Judah eventually convinced Collis P. Huntington, Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Croker, to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company and start building the Transcontinental Railroad. So he's the one that said, look, we can do this. Okay, if you form a railroad company, all you big rich people, then we can make it happen. Theodore Judah was one of the most important men in convincing railroad officials to begin building the Transcontinental Railroad. He knew that things could be done. He's an engineer. That's what engineers do. They're able to figure out problems, right? So he's like, look, we can do this. I can show you how, I can tell you how, and it'll be a huge win for the country. Sadly, he didn't live to see it finished. He died of yellow fever after a trip through Panama in 1863. So down in Panama, there is now, and again, I don't remember exactly when it was formed, but there is a Panama Canal that connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. So I'm wondering if he was down there to say, hey, we can build a canal to connect these two large bodies of water. All right, so that is your newspaper for this week. Okay, so this one is really cool, like I said. I hope you guys enjoy watching the videos about how technology, not technology, but transportation and communication really affected these people that moved out west. And it's hard for us to wrap our head around, like, oh, traveling from here to here took 10 days when now it could probably take us 2 or 3. But you got to think, it took them months to travel from the east to the west. Then with the railroads and the steamboats, it only took them a matter of a week and a half. That's a huge, huge difference. So this week, you got to highlight. You have it's actually this map activity, but I put it on a Word doc for you. So you have another map activity. Make sure you use the map and answer the questions using the map. Do your test. Remember, if you can, print it off, answer the questions on the paper, but please put them online. Put the answers online because it'll score it for you, okay? Obviously, if you're having issues with putting it online, then I'll accept the paper test, but please try to put your test online. Or if you're able to, put 2 tabs up. You know, open a tab for your articles and open a tab for the test, okay? And then, of course, you can do your crossword for extra credit again this week, all right? So get your stuff in, turn it into me. Work hard, stay focused, and enjoy learning about how we were able to continue to expand this country. Okay? Bye, guys.